Singapore is set to submit its enhanced carbon emissions goal to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change when parties to the Paris Agreement meet at COP27. Now, the annual climate change conference begins next Sunday in the city of Sharm El-Sheikh in Egypt.
And for more on why Singapore's participation in COP27 is important, we're joined now by Melissa Loh. She's Research Fellow at the NUS Centre for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. Good evening, Ms. Loh. Thank you for joining us. Firstly, there are key goals for the summit. What are the areas of focus that we can expect from COP27?
Thanks for having me. So COP27 is the first time in 6 years that the COP will be held in an African country, Sharm El-Sheikh, Egypt. So the key focus areas, of course, will be issues like adaptation, loss and damage, climate finance. And of course, there's also the mitigation work program that countries are expected to be doing in order to raise climate ambition before 2030. And finally, there's the technical dialogue of the global stocktake that will happen next year.
DPM Lawrence Wong said earlier this week that Singapore only accounts for something like 0.1% of global emissions. I guess the question is, how much impact then can our tougher 2030 emissions target make, and does it matter?
Yeah, so earlier this week, DPM Lawrence Wong announced that Singapore will submit an enhanced nationally determined contribution this year. It's for Singapore to achieve a lower fixed target of 60 million tonnes by 2030. And what we'll do is essentially peak earlier and then come down to 60 million tonnes in 2030. And that will be our new target. And indeed, although Singapore only contributes to 0.1% of global emissions, it signals to the world that we have revisited and strengthened our climate ambition and our climate target, as was agreed at COP26 in Glasgow last year. So it's important that we send a strong signal to everyone that we're committed to addressing climate change.
Ms. Loh, we just covered this news on Asia Tonight earlier. Climate Central, a climate science think tank, released a report which specifically cites Singapore as being among the most highly exposed major cities, with human-induced heat increasing health risks to millions. I mean, it underscores, doesn't it, why Singapore needs to be part of this COP27 effort, even though our global emissions is comparatively small.
That's right. So even though our global emissions is comparatively small, Singapore is also dependent on a lot of countries for food imports, even water, you could say, from our neighbors. So absolutely important that we participate in this multilateral rules-based platform like the COP in order to get our voice heard. And by submitting a target, in fact, what this means is that Singapore can then be a credible party to the negotiations. And we can also encourage others to do the same and inspire them to also likewise put forward more ambitious targets.
So is that the role you see Singapore playing, to be that advocate and that cheerleader, and to sort of set the direction and tone for other countries to hopefully follow? Because quite frankly, there isn't always that political will, is there?
Yeah, that's right. And I think what I'm really excited about this year is Singapore will for the first time hold a Singapore pavilion at the COP. And I've been tracking the COP for over 10 years. And I think this being the first year in having a pavilion, this means that Singapore can really showcase how innovative we are and the kinds of technologies and innovations that we've showcased and we've come up with in Singapore, and bring that to the world. And hopefully we can form some further partnerships and collaboration and do better in the future.
Ms. Loh, we understand that you've observed 10 editions of this climate conference. You must have seen so much change, you must have seen so much achieved, but also the sort of long runway that we still have to travel as far as the climate action story is concerned. How hopeful should we continue to be with what these climate conferences can achieve?
Yeah, so my first COP was COP15 in Copenhagen back in 2009. And since then, I've seen an absolute proliferation of interest in attending the COP meetings and participating and bringing these issues back home as well, and building capacity among young people and anybody really who's interested in anything relating to the COP. And I think what's most important is what we do after. So over time, I think we should see less importance placed on the COP, but actually more on implementation. And we are indeed entering the decade of implementation in the 2020s. So I think over time, we should see less emphasis on the COP meetings, although there's still some important issues to be discussed. But more people should definitely be back home addressing climate change and climate action in their own way.
The ever-optimistic Melissa Low, a research fellow at NUS. Thank you so much.